The structure of my presentation is like the first part will be about theories on differentiated integration. This will be the boring part. You can take a sleep. And then I will wake you up when I reach the practical lessons from the earlier enlargement. So what is definition? What is the definition of integration? I accepted the definition of Schimmel, Fenning and Thomas Vincent. They say that integration is the body of binding formal rules to which the states participating in integration agree to adhere. And there are different typology of differentiation. First, it can be internally differentiated, like the Eurozone, because not every member state is part of it. Or we can talk about external differentiation. For example, the European Economic Area or the bilateral agreements with Switzerland, which refused to accept membership in the European Economic Area and opted for this kind of solution. And it can be the mixture of the two, like Schengen, which involves countries outside the European Union. And differentiation may be de jure or de facto. For example, de facto differentiation is created by framework directives which allow member states certain leeway when they implement them. Also, informal cooperation between the member states can lead to differentiated integration. And this differentiation can be codified either in the treaties, so in primary law, or in the legislative acts, the secondary law of the European Union. And I just noticed that the bottom part is missing from this slide. But anyway, maybe I can remember what I wrote there. So I think the most important kind of typology is instrumental differentiation and so-called constitutional differentiation, because instrumental differentiation is mainly induced by enlargement. It means that the newcomers get a certain time period, and within this time period they can catch up to the other member states, they can fulfill the requirements. However, the constitutional differentiation is based on a different logic. It is based on principles and based on ideas how a good integration should look like, and therefore this is a more permanent one. For example, the champions of this kind of differentiation was the UK, which always seek for opt-outs. So as I mentioned, this is mainly based on ideas and ideologies, and there's a peculiarity of the EU, because earlier and to a certain extent today, the periphery is not the club of the poor castaways. Instead, it's more often a club of the rich mavericks, like the United Kingdom or Denmark, who see for these kind of opt-outs from EU law. And then I examine the supply side of the differentiation. In order to create a constitutional differentiation in an integration and to maintain it, there are certain criteria that need to be met. First, the insider group who persists on maintaining the unified rules has to be large enough to provide for an effective integration. Otherwise, the disintegration will occur. Of course, we saw other examples. For example, one member state tried to disintegrate a bit from the uniform rules, and this ended up in a surprising popular vote, which resulted in the withdrawal of the United Kingdom. Second, it is about the externalities. So the externalities between the insiders and the outsiders, that is to say the refusers, have to be low. Because in case there is a high level of positive externalities for the outsiders, so they can cherry pick or free ride. For example, this can happen in environmental cooperation, that the outsiders also enjoy the results of this cooperation. So this will encourage the outsiders to stay out as long as they can. But this can also make the insiders to reconsider their point in maintaining a deeper integration. There is a high level of negative externalities. It can induce the developed outsiders to either try to hinder the deepening of the integration, provided that they have a superior bargaining power, or they can decide to join the club instead of hindering the others. For the less developed countries or outsiders, it creates an incentive to comply as soon as they are able to comply. And third, it is easier to opt for a differentiated integration at the beginning of the integration, but as historic examples show, certain member states seek for differentiated integration later and not at the beginning. It is because, according to neo-functionalist theory, governments typically have a short time horizon. They are either unwilling or unable to predict the change of the integration preferences and also certain path dependencies which are created by institutional factors such as the rules on the decision-making and the power of supranational actors, for example, in case of the EU. And there is also the instrumental differentiation. Most often, enlargement generates concerns about welfare. These questions about redistribution and efficiency. The old member states fear that they lose some kind of economic advantage or some kind of EU foundings, and also they fear because the new member states have weak capacity to comply with the requirements. This can mean that they have cheap labor force and so on and so on. But also the candidate states too may have their own fears and reservation because they have to implement demanding regulatory standards, which is not easy at the beginning at least. And which is a supply side of the instrumental differentiation. First, there is a lack of alternative for the candidates. It is so it is a very good example of which the European Free Trade Agreement can provide us. For example, the UK first joined this club. It was launched as an anti-European economic community club because the British and some other countries didn't want to join a club run by the French and the German. But 1 year later, the United Kingdom changed its mind and submitted its appliance for the European economic community. Second, the candidates market is much smaller than the internal market, so this is also something that they have to take into account. And of course, the decision rules favor the member states. For example, every member state can say no to a newcomer, so they have to negotiate according to them. So, as a result, it will lead to a so-called love it or leave it situation for the candidate states. They can either decide to not to join the club or to accept detrimental conditions in certain cases. And what is the support for the differentiated integration within the EU institutions? There is a Commission white paper. There was a Commission white paper in 2017. Its scenario number 3 said that those who want more can do more. But if we compare it with Juncker's State of Union address in the same year, he was not favoring it. And also the European Parliament 2 years later, in a political declaration, said that it is only a second best option and that it can be only a temporary step on the path towards a more effective and integrated policy making. And there's a fraction between old and newer member states, because old member states more tend to support differentiated integration, while the new member states and mostly the northern states tend to be against because they're afraid that it will lead to a kind of second-class citizenship. And also if we examine the declaration of the heads of states and governments, for example, the French, the German, the Italian and the Spanish government in 2017 declared jointly that they are in favor. Also President Macron in the same year was strongly in favor. But for example, the V4 governments, for example, the former Polish Prime Minister Duda and the Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán were against this kind of differentiation. And also, if we read the memoirs of János Martonyi, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs earlier, he also was against this kind of differentiation. And now I arrive to the practical part of my presentation. So when it became the so-called Fata Morgana of the European Union, because at the Maastricht era, there was a consensus that the EU can grow forever, or at least to the geographical borders of Europe. And the reasons were the successful integration of the 73 and the 95 countries. The 73 countries were the UK, Ireland and Denmark, and Ireland and Denmark were relatively poor countries in Western standards. Of course, my grandmother would have been happy if she lived that standard in Hungary in the 70s, but they were poor in Western standards. But they managed to make good use of the EU money, and they become very rich countries. And for example, the Danish people are not only very rich, but they are the happiest EU citizens because they don't have to take second shifts after they finish their first job and do so on. They can enjoy life. And also, the Central European countries became independent as the Soviets withdrew from Eastern Europe. So it became possible to incorporate them into the Western world. And also there was a heightened atmosphere around Maastricht. We should not forget that under Jacques Delors, there was a very glorious 10 years for the European Union. So they decided that we will welcome everybody who would like to join. But it became clear that the Central European countries had a different background. After 30 years of communism, they faced similar social, legal, and economical challenges. For example, the lack of democratic traditions, poor alignment with the rule of law requirements, and also planned economy. They had to modernize their economy, they had to modernize their laws, and so on and so on. And there were some country-specific challenges which I learned from the country reports of my colleagues. For example, the dissolution of Czechoslovakia meant that both countries had to establish their own diplomatic services. This hindered the negotiations with the European Union. In case of Slovakia, the Mečiar government had an anti-Western attitude, and it was not until 95 when the Mečiar government was dismissed by the voters and Slovakia made a Western turn. And also the poor economic condition of Poland at that time, and also in Hungary, it was the so-called Bokros package, which was a necessary economic package to save the economy. But whenever somebody who is older hears the name Bokros, he has shivering, from his name, because it was a very drastic economic reform at that time. But there was a similar strength in these countries. The population was very determined that they want to belong to Western Europe. So there was a pro-European attitude to a more or less degree. And I think these countries successfully managed to prevail their interest during the negotiations, despite the so-called superior bargaining power of the member states, which I mentioned earlier. Of course, we had to take certain pills because of the EU. We have to accept certain things. which were not good, but we managed some kind of derogations which were in favor of us. For example, the free movement of capital was restricted in order to protect our agricultural lands until we can. And also we are managed to gain agricultural dotations, despite at the beginning the EU said that we will not get any agricultural dotation. It was the Hungarian chief negotiator who managed to negotiate it. And here it comes, the 2007 and 2013 countries. Bulgaria accessed with Romania to the EU, but it was not in the focus of the research at that time. So Romania and Croatia already faced more serious issues than the 2004 Central European countries. For example, in case of Romania, there was a lack of political willingness before before the 96 presidential elections. And also the judicial system displayed so severe shortcomings that a so-called CVM mechanism has to be established. And this mechanism meant that the European Commission monitored how the Romanian party meets the benchmarks of the rule of law requirements and the independence of the judiciary. And this CVM mechanism became the subject of heated debates between the Court of Justice of the European Union and the Romanian Constitutional Court. And also, in case of Croatia, we had to face the burdened common history of the Western Balkan states. For example, Croatia had to undertake to prosecute war crimes, but in this case, the candidate country displayed a very friendly attitude, and they soon get positive feedback from the chief prosecutor of the ICTY. And also undertook to settle the border dispute regarding the Pirene Bay, which is still not settled, to certain disagreements between the parties. And if you have a long night and you can't sleep, I have an article about this border dispute, so I can recommend it. So the conclusions for these countries is that any shortcomings should be handled before a country is let to enter the EU. These can be settled. Otherwise, these can seriously hinder the countries catching up on specific fields or can practically cause a permanent halt in solving the problems. So, for example, I don't really see any opportunities to settle this Pirene Bay debate. And now, the current candidates from the Western Balkan era. There was a stabilization and association process around the millennium, and at the Thessaloniki European Council, the European Union affirmed that they are possible candidate states. And which are the most important common issues? And sorry for the Serbian colleagues in the second row for mentioning Kosovo. One of my colleagues asked that, is it a fixation for you that you always talk about Kosovo? But this is, I think, as the professor already mentioned, a very, very serious problem if we want to accept both Serbia and Kosovo into the European Union. But of course, it is unjust to blame only Serbia on this issue because some EU member state doesn't recognize Kosovo as well. So it is a very interesting situation where we have diplomatic negotiations with a country which is not an independent country according to some member states. Also historical grievances towards each other and deficiencies in prosecuting war crimes in the case of some countries, deficiencies in compliance with rule of law requirements, and there is a laconic feeling because of the long accession process. However, the popular support for the EU membership is very high or relatively high in these countries, except for Serbia. As far as I know, it's about only 30% within the population. And what are the individual issues which I identified? For example, Albania is it's an upper middle income country. It started from a very bad position after the change of regime, but still a lot of effort is needed. Bosnia and Herzegovina has tensions, for example, with Serbia due to Serbia's relations with the Republika Srpska entity of the country. Kosovo, as I mentioned, is not recognized as an independent state, both by EU member states and candidates. Montenegro, which was a federal state with Serbia, had hindrances due to the failure of the so-called twin-track approach of the European Union. and also the dissolution delayed the negotiations. North Macedonia has serious grievances because of his name. It had to be changed to North Macedonia. If Professor Karakamisheva were here, she could talk a lot about it. And also they are mad at the Bulgarians who are forcing the amendment of the Constitution of Macedonia to incorporate the Bulgarian minorities into the Constitution. And here it comes Serbia. While the country is well aligned with the requirements of the single market, there are serious issues which are mostly matter of principle. And that is the problem in case of accession to EU, because it will not lead to instrumental differentiation, it will lead to constitutional differentiation if they will access the European Union. So Kosovo is one problem, lagging in prosecuting war crimes, and also it happens according to Commission reports that war crimes are denied in mass media, and also perpetrators are glorified as national heroes, and also the low popular support for EU membership, and questionable strategic directions of the Serbian government, the close relationship with Russia or China. And of course, this close relationship with Russia has some historical reasons maybe, or some kind of feeling that they had a shared history or shared historical grievances. And here comes the most new or the newest candidate countries, like for example, okay, Turkey is an odd one out here, but I didn't want to add Turkey for a different group. So the new candidates, Moldova, Ukraine, and also Georgia. So some of them fell, and some of them presumably fell into what Moscow considers as its own sphere of interest. For example, in case of Georgia, it was also shown by a very short war back in the 2000s, in 2008. So we don't have to like this fact, but we have to count with that, I think. There are deficiencies in rule of law. There is high level of corruption, whatever they say, and hardship to conform the requirements of the single market. For example, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine has a free trade agreement with the European Union, but there are hardship, for example, the Georgian wine producers, because they cannot comply with the requirements of the EU regulation because they are so strict. So these are hindering issues. So what are the individual issues? Turkey is the oldest candidate state. It applied for membership when I was born in '87, and the actual negotiation process started in 2005. But the negotiations came to a standstill in 2018 when the Council declared that Turkey has been moving further away from the European Union. However, in 2023, the High Representative of the EU and the Commission issued a joint communique to negotiate on certain strategic issues instead of membership. I think this is a sign of external differentiated integration. So we can talk about business, just leave the hard things aside from the table, and we can cooperate if we want to. So this is, when it comes to Georgia, the EU accession is not a priority of the current government. It also postponed talks and does not take grants until 2028. And also, as I mentioned, the lessons from the earlier war can be a warning sign. Moldova has a problem with the Transnistrian region, which is actually falls outside the scope of the austerities power. And it is an interesting question if Moldova will ever access the European Union. Will it come without the Transnistrian region, or will it come with it? Or the so-called Cyprian model will prevail, so the country will access without that region. And Ukraine. Ukraine had a very bad economic situation due to the earlier clashes with the Russian-backed forces and due to the annex of the Crimean region. And also the current war with Russia made a very big destruction in the country's economy. According to World Bank estimations, it would need almost $500 billion to rebuild its economy, and the EU so far allocated only 120 billion euro to help Ukraine in this process. And there is a specific issue which, as a Hungarian, I cannot leave without a word. There's a tension between Hungary and Ukraine, but it did not start with the war. It started with the Ukrainian law on minorities, which is very, very detrimental to the Hungarian minorities within the country. They are not allowed to learn on their mother tongue in state-owned schools. So, to conclude my thoughts, except for the earlier enlargement rules in the 70s or in the 90s, the integration of the newcomers by the member states and conforming the rules by the candidates or possible candidates become harder and more demanding. And in my opinion, the momentum of the Maastricht era has blown out. The EU has most probably reached the geographical borders beyond which it is not reasonable to stretch anymore. But may the history prove me wrong. So in my opinion, leaving the out Caesar, out nihil attitude, that is considering full membership as the only possibility, will open the road for external differentiation with a free trade agreement and a limited access to the single market for these countries, without all the other requirements which the candidate or possible candidate countries cannot or does not wish to take. Thank you very much for your attention.